It was the last Friday in October that most of those county roads were good for driving, and Roy Callender knew it. The rains that come to central Ohio in the first week of November have a way of making decisions for you, filling the ditches, softening the shoulders, turning the gravel 2 tracks between the fields into something that argues back against the tires. Roy had been farming Morrow County soil since he was 19 years old. He knew what a dark November sky meant. He left anyway, because Jessie had the day off school and had asked to come, and because you do not tell a 17-year-old girl who is going to Ohio State in 9 months that she cannot ride with her father to look at a bull on a Friday afternoon. You say yes. You get in the truck. You go. They left the farmhouse on Belmont Road at 3:15 p.m. On November 6, 1992, in Roy's 1988 Ford F-250, heading south on County Road 14 toward the Aldrich farm, 42 miles away. Jessie had her window down a crack despite the cold. Roy had the radio on a country station out of Columbus. The corn had been out of the fields for 3 weeks, and the land on both sides of the road lay flat and bare and enormous in the gray afternoon light. They never arrived at the Aldrich farm. By 9 o'clock that evening, when Roy had not answered 3 calls to the house phone, his neighbor Earl Sims walked down the gravel drive and found the farmhouse dark. The OSU acceptance letter was still on the kitchen table where Jessie had set it that morning, weighted down by a coffee mug. Earl went home and called the Morrow County Sheriff's Office. 29 years passed. Then a farmer running a maintenance backhoe along a drainage culvert on County Road 14 in the spring of 2021 hit something his equipment had no business hitting. And everything that had seemed to be one kind of story, a disappearance, a mystery, 2 people who had simply gone and never come back, turned out to be another kind entirely. The kind where the answer was always exactly where the first search had looked and could not see. But to understand what was found in that culvert, you have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Roy and Jessie Callender were. Morrow County, Ohio, in the early 1990s, was the kind of place that measured time by the agricultural calendar and nothing else. Planting in May. First cutting of hay in June. Weed off by July. Corn in October, if the weather held. The county seat of Mount Gilead had a hardware store and a feed co-op and a diner on Main Street called Patton's that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon because the farmers came in whenever they got there and not a minute before. The roads between the towns ran straight and flat across the former lake bottom, bisecting fields that went on until they didn't. And in November, after the harvest, you could stand on the shoulder of County Road 14 and see in every direction until the earth curved away. Roy Callender had farmed 320 acres on Belmont Road since his father handed the operation over in 1981. He was a practical, specific man who kept his equipment in working order and his books in pencil and had the kind of reputation that accrues over 20 years of doing what you say you will do and not making a fuss about it. He was 48 years old. He drove a green John Deere that was 11 years old and ran as well as the day he bought it, because he maintained it that way. He was the kind of farmer other farmers called when they were trying to diagnose an engine problem or needed a second opinion on a soil test, and he answered those calls because that was how it was done. His wife Karen had died of ovarian cancer in 1988 when Jessie was 13. Roy had raised her on his own for the 4 years since, which the community understood to have been done without complaint and with more competence than most men of his generation would have brought to it. Jessie Callender was 17 years old, a senior at Mount Gilead High School, and had been accepted to the College of Veterinary Medicine at Ohio State University. She had known she wanted to be a veterinarian since she was 9 years old, when Roy had let her help with a difficult calving and she had not flinched once. Her FIFA chapter had given her their Outstanding Senior Award. She wore her mother's watch, a small gold Seiko that Karen had gotten as a gift when she turned 30, on her left wrist every day. Roy had given it to her on her 15th birthday, and she had not taken it off since. The acceptance letter from Ohio State had arrived that Wednesday. Jessie had called her grandmother in Newark from the kitchen phone and read the whole thing aloud. Roy had heard it from the barn and come inside without being asked. That Friday afternoon, driving south on County Road 14, she had the letter folded in the front pocket of her jacket. The Morrow County Sheriff's Office opened a missing persons file on Roy and Jessie Callender at 11:40 p.m. On November 6, 1992, the deputy who drove to the Belmont Road farmhouse first was a 29-year-old woman named Connie Marsh, 4 years on the force, who noted the unlocked house, the letter on the table, the barn secured, and the absence of the green F-250. She called it in at midnight. 2 adults missing, vehicle not located, no signs of disturbance. By the following morning, the search was county-wide. The route from Belmont Road to the Aldrich farm was driven 3 times in the daylight hours of November 7th. Neighbors checked fields and creek beds on both sides of County Road 14. The Ohio State Highway Patrol was notified. Earl Sims told investigators about the darkness of the farmhouse the night before. The Aldrich family confirmed that Roy had called to confirm the appointment on Thursday, but had never arrived. Gerald Callender, Roy's older brother, the one who would eventually administer the estate, drove down from Columbus that first morning and stood in his brother's kitchen and looked at the acceptance letter on the table and understood that he had no frame of reference for what he was looking at. He had farmed the same land as Roy. He knew the roads. He knew his brother. He did not know what to do with a letter from Ohio State sitting under a coffee mug in an empty kitchen. At 2:30 p.m. On November 7th, a driver on County Road 14 reported seeing what he thought was a gap in the vegetation along the drainage ditch embankment at the curve near mile marker 6, where the road bent south around a section line. Deputies investigated. They found broken vegetation on the embankment and what appeared to be fresh scoring in the mud of the ditch bank, marks consistent with a vehicle leaving the road. They searched the drainage culvert below. The culvert was an agricultural tile drainage collector, approximately 12 feet wide and 6 feet deep at its deepest point, running east along the section line for 300 yards before emptying into a creek. On November 7, 1992, after 3 days of rain, it held 4 feet of fast-moving water and dense November mud. Searchers waded it. A dive team from Marion County made 2 passes. They found nothing. The water was too opaque. The mud too deep. The culvert too long to rule out conclusively with the equipment available and the time available before the water level rose further. The search coordinator noted in the official report that the vehicle, if it had entered the culvert, may have been carried downstream by the current. The creek was also searched for 2 miles in both directions. Nothing was found. By November 14th, 8 days after Roy and Jessie Callender were last seen, the active search was suspended, pending new information. 8 days. Connie Marsh did not agree with the suspension. She said so in writing, in a formal memo to the search coordinator that is still part of the case file. She argued that the culvert at mile marker 6 had not been adequately cleared given the water conditions during the original search, and that it warranted a follow-up when the water level dropped. She was told the resources were needed elsewhere and that the case would be monitored. She kept her copy of the memo. Roy's neighbor Earl Sims drove the road himself on a Sunday in December, slowly. In the daylight, looking at the ditch line. He stopped at the curve near mile marker 6. He stood on the shoulder and looked down at the culvert and the still broken vegetation on the embankment. He told his wife that night that something had happened at that curve. She said he should tell the sheriff's office. He had already told them. They had already looked. There was nothing there to find. Roy Calendar's farm was sold by the estate in 1995, 3 years after he and Jesse disappeared. Roy's brother Gerald had administered the estate and had held it as long as he reasonably could. But without a death certificate and without a resolution, the practical needs of the situation eventually prevailed. The day the farm transferred was in April, a planting month, and Gerald drove out to Belmont Road to hand over the keys and stood for a while in the driveway, looking at the fields that his brother had farmed for 26 years, and then he drove back to Columbus. By 1997, 5 years had passed. The Morrow County Sheriff's Office had received 4 tips about the case, 2 of which concerned a man seen at a gas station in Cardington on the night of November 6th, which Connie Marsh had investigated thoroughly and eliminated. The green F-250 had not been found. Roy and Jesse had not been found. The case file had grown by 42 pages and resolved nothing. Jesse's grandmother in Newark, Karen's mother, the one Jesse had called the day the acceptance letter arrived, died in 2001 without knowing what had happened to her granddaughter. She had told her pastor, in one of their last conversations, that the not knowing was the thing she could not carry anymore. She had made her peace with the worst, but the not knowing was different from the worst. The not knowing had no floor. By 2005, the fields along County Road 14 had been sold twice. The curve near mile marker 6 had been repaved as part of a county road maintenance project in 1999. The vegetation on the ditch embankment had fully regrown. A new wooden fence post had been installed on the east side of the road at the curve, though no guardrail had been added. The drainage culvert, which ran under seasonal water from November to April, had been accumulating silt and organic matter every spring and fall for 13 years, deepening its sediment floor by several inches each cycle. Connie Marsh retired from the Morrow County Sheriff's Office in 2014 after 26 years on the job. She took the calendar file home in a box. Her husband Jim had long since accepted that some boxes were not for unpacking. She kept it in the spare bedroom and looked at it on the anniversary of the disappearance each November, which she had done every year since 1993. She had never stopped believing the culvert at mile marker 6 was the answer. By 2015, Jesse Calendar would have been 40 years old. Roy's brother Gerald had a granddaughter who was the same age Jesse had been when she disappeared. He did not mention this to anyone. The EFA Outstanding Senior Award had been framed and was hanging in the Mount Gilead High School hallway, in the case that held the chapter's history. A teacher who had been a student the year Jesse disappeared sometimes stopped in front of it on the way to her classroom. Then, in the spring of 2021, a farmer named Dennis Hoke was hired to clean out the drainage culvert along the section line east of mile marker 6 on County Road 14. The county's drainage maintenance backlog had grown by 3 years, pushed out each budget cycle. Dennis had done 4 other culverts that week. He was operating a backhoe, and on the second pass through the accumulated sediment at the base of the culvert, the bucket caught something that stopped the machine. Every case on this channel comes from weeks of research, verifying records, tracking down documents, rebuilding lives that were lost and deserve to be remembered fully. If you want us to keep doing this work, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Roy and Jesse. Dennis Hoke had been operating equipment in Morrow County for 31 years, and he had pulled a great many things out of drainage ditches. none of which had prepared him for what the backhoe bucket struck at a depth of approximately 6 feet below the sediment surface of the culvert on County Road 14 on May 11, 2021. He shut off the machine. He climbed down. He looked at what the bucket had partially exposed, and he looked at it for a long time without moving. Then he called the Morrow County Sheriff's Office. The responding deputies arrived within 20 minutes. What they found was the roof of a vehicle, partially exposed by the backhoe strike, at depth in the accumulated sediment and debris of the culvert floor. A vehicle that had been there long enough that the organic material packed around it had essentially become the culvert itself. The truck integrated into the drainage infrastructure of the section line, the way a stone becomes part of a riverbed. The vehicle was a 1988 Ford F-250. Green. Recovery of the truck and its contents took 3 days and required a crane, a structural engineering consultation about the culvert walls, and coordination between the Morrow County Sheriff, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the Ohio Department of Transportation. Connie Marsh drove out from her house in Mount Gilead on the morning of May 13th and stood on the road above the culvert in her civilian clothes and watched the crane work. What the recovery established was the following. Roy Callender had taken the curve at mile marker 6 at speed, in low visibility rain, on a road with no guardrail, and the truck had left the road, gone through the embankment vegetation, and entered the culvert at an angle that had carried it under the surface of the floodwater and into the sediment accumulation at the culvert's base. The truck had been submerged and covered within the first spring melt. The search in November 1992 had been conducted when the vehicle was already below the mudline. The dive team had passed within yards of it. Roy and Jesse Callender were both in the truck. They had been there for 29 years. They had never left Morrow County. They were 600 yards from the nearest farmhouse and a mile and a half from the field they had grown up in, and the world had simply closed over them and kept going. Roy Callender's brother Gerald was notified by phone on the evening of May 13, 2021. He was 74 years old and had been waiting 29 years for a call that would end the not knowing one way or the other. He had imagined the call many times in those 29 years. In some versions, Roy and Jesse were alive. In some versions, someone had done something terrible and had finally been caught. In some versions, there was no call at all, and the not knowing simply extended until it became its own kind of answer. He said, "Thank God." And then, he said nothing else for a while. The deputy on the other end of the phone let the silence be. She had been briefed on the case history before making the call. She was younger than the case itself. Connie Marsh drove to the culvert on County Road 14 the morning after the recovery was confirmed. She stood on the shoulder of the road above where the crane had been working. She looked at the place where the embankment vegetation had been cleared and the culvert exposed. She had stood on this same shoulder in November 1992 in the rain and looked at the same curve and written in her memo that this location warranted a follow-up search when water levels dropped. 29 years later, she had been right. Being right did not feel the way she had expected it would. It felt like standing on a county road in the morning and understanding that some things can be true for a very long time without anyone being able to prove it. There is no perpetrator in this story. That is what makes it different from most stories in this genre, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment. Roy and Jesse Callender did not encounter malice on County Road 14. They encountered a curve and rain and the dark and the absence of a guardrail on a rural road that had been built for a different era's traffic speeds, and those things together were enough. There is no one to arrest. There is no one to unmask. There is no monster hiding in plain sight. There is only a November afternoon in 1992, a father who said yes to his daughter's request to come along, a truck that went off a road in the dark, and 29 years of not knowing for Gerald Callender and his family, for the community that had searched and grieved and carried the uncertainty forward, for Connie Marsh, who had not agreed with the suspension of the search and had been right not to agree, though being right did not change what had happened. The Ohio Department of Transportation installed a guardrail on the curve at mile marker 6 on County Road 14 in August 2021. The county engineer noted in the installation report that the road had been flagged for guardrail review in 2004 and again in 2011, and that the project had been deferred both times for budget reasons. The guardrail cost $14,000. Jesse Callender's acceptance letter from Ohio State University is in the Morrow County Historical Society's archive, donated by the Callender family after the recovery. It is kept in an acid-free folder with her FA award ribbon and a photograph of the green F-250 parked in the Belmont Road driveway, taken the summer before she disappeared. Her mother's watch was recovered with the truck. It was returned to the family. Roy Callender was 59 years old when he was found, measured by the calendar from 1992 to 2021. He had been 48 when he said yes to his daughter and got in the truck on a November afternoon, and nothing about who he was, the kind of farmer other farmers called. The father who came inside from the barn when he heard the acceptance letter being read aloud, nothing about any of that was reducible to the way the story ended. What do you make of the decision to suspend the search after 8 days? And do you think the outcome could have been different with better equipment or more time? Connie Marsh spent 29 years carrying a case she knew was unresolved. What does that kind of sustained commitment cost a person, and what does it say about the people who do that work? And what should we think about the $14,000 guardrail that wasn't there in 1992 and wasn't installed until a farmer's backhoe found what the search couldn't? Justice found Roy and Jesse Callender after 29 years, not through a breakthrough or a confession, but through a piece of farm equipment and a county maintenance crew doing work that was 30 years overdue. Stories like theirs remind us that not every disappearance has a villain, but every disappearance has a family waiting to know. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and stay with us. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.